Hi, everyone. I'm Jess Falkenthal, and I'm the Community Director for CUE San Francisco. CUE is a professional development organization that helps teachers learn new technologies and pedagogies that they can use in their classrooms to improve student learning. I've been involved with CUE for 3 years, and they primarily are run by educators and are also affiliated with ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. My handle on Twitter is @jfalkenthal if you want to tweet about Unconferences. I am so excited to talk to you about Unconferences because they are my absolute most favorite type of event. So what do? I do community and marketing for different ed tech companies, as well as other education organizations like universities and education nonprofits. I have actually attended 200 online events in the year 2020. So I have looked at bad events, good events, all different types of events. And I'm a Techstars Startup Weekend Global Facilitator. So I volunteer on the weekends occasionally to travel or virtually travel to different cities around the world and then facilitate 54-hour innovation boot camps that help early stage entrepreneurs find their co-founders and build a prototype in one weekend. Then I also am super excited about geocaching. It's a treasure hunt. That's what I like to do for fun. And I also am an Airbnb experience host on the weekends where I lead treasure hunting tours in Golden Gate Park. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about the Unconference model. And then after our workshop, you're invited to actually go into our Unconference for one session. We're going to understand how Unconferences fit into your event strategy. We're going to talk about leaving with resources to implement Unconferences in your community. And then at 11 a.m., super optional, completely understand if that's your lunch break, and that's 11 a.m. Pacific time. You'll participate in an Unconference session where you'll get to meet lots of other CMXers from all over the world and talk about something that you're super passionate about. And several people put the bit.ly link into the chat for me, which is where we will submit session topics, which you can start now or you can do later because we'll have time for that. So what to expect today? Again, we're going to share our experiences. So right now, I'd love to know, have you attended an Unconference? If so, please let us know in the chat. And if you haven't been to an Unconference before, let us know that as well. Ooh, several people who ran them before. What about a virtual Unconference? So I am not the inventor of Unconferences. Unconferences have been going on, actually, I read on Wikipedia since like the 1800s, which is crazy to think about. But the first one that I think the modern Unconference people associate with Foo Camp, which was for the Friends of O'Reilly Media. And then it kind of spun off and created many different types of Unconferences. I'm going to share a little about my Unconference story about how I put together Unconferences for educators last year. And then I'm going to share some resources that you can use to be able to facilitate your own Unconference. Following that, we will, sorry, my mouse is being a little funny right now. We're going to reflect and think about how it will work for you. And then there'll be question and answer time at the end. We'll have 15 minutes reserved for you to ask any questions that you have. Cool. And then again, you're invited to our one Unconference session at 11 a.m., which is super optional. But I think we're going to actually have a separate Unsummit later this year. Anne Marie and I have been brainstorming about that idea. So there are Unconferences for everyone. Again, I mentioned Foo Camp, the Friends of O'Reilly, was probably one of the first Unconference themes that really got big and grew all over the place. You might have also heard of Bar Camp, which is the name of another Unconference, which is about many different topics. Foo Camp tended to be for developers. I like to organize ed camps for educators by educators. And then there's Parent Camp, which blew up last year of parents producing events, unconference events for parents, and they had to share so many different things as we all learned how to be a parent while working from home and to balance work and family life or integrate it somehow. There's product camp, unconferences for product managers, gov camp, people who are interested in public affairs, and they have their own unconferences. And there's other variations. So you may have seen at a conference a birds of a feather discussion. We've had birds of a feather at multiple different CMX summits over the years. And they're a really great way to find your people in a smaller group and then to be able to have your own conversation that can go in any direction. There are some other formats that are kind of variations of unconferences that are described here that you could kind of look up as well. So what's the difference between an unconference and a conference? I'm sure you're wondering. By the way, we're talking about unconferences here, not conferences. Okay, so first of all, let's talk about the delivery. The delivery of an unconference, well, a delivery of a conference, you're thinking of a pre-planned session, you've curated the speakers, you have some excellent people, they've like rehearsed a gazillion times, they have some slides that they're going to share. An unconference is an impromptu discussion. You don't know before the event happens which discussions are going to take place, and everyone's involved in them. The content for a conference is top down. Somebody makes the decision of what's going to be part of the conference and curates it. The content that goes in an unconference is user generated. It all comes from your community. So in my opinion, it's the most community-centric event you could possibly do because the community's in charge. Now, who decides at an unconference versus a conference? Well, I like to think about it as a conference organizer plans, what do I want to teach you? And in an unconference, it's what we want to learn together. It's all about collaboratively deciding and then collaborating on taking ownership over the discussion. The formats are going from stage on a stage of one person saying, these are all the things I want you to know, and I'm the expert here, versus the other format of an unconference being it's a collaborative discussion and nobody owns anything here. Everybody's collaborating together on sharing knowledge and building relationships. And then the style. The style could be sit and get at a conference, and at an unconference, it's active, engaging participation. So that kind of shows you the difference between a conference and an unconference. Now, this might be making you a little bit uncomfortable. Unconferences tend to make brands pretty uncomfortable if you're used to like owning everything. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story of 2020 and how I got started planning virtual unconferences. I've attended and facilitated multiple unconferences in person in San Francisco and many other cities around the United States. But in 2020, think back to March last year. Teachers were going home for spring break, but they were being told that spring break might be extended because something crazy was happening here. But don't worry, it might only be a very short period of time. It might only be 2 weeks extra at home. So the teachers weren't really trained on what they needed to do for virtual instruction. In some cases, in some school districts, they actually were trained. Now, educators are my audience in my community, so that's why I'm talking about this. So while we were listening to our community, we were starting to feel like teachers were getting uncomfortable, that they weren't receiving enough training on these specific topics, and that day to day and week to week, what they needed to know was changing. As we moved into April, educators were starting to test and experiment, but we're still feeling underprepared. So at the beginning of April, when we saw what was happening, we decided that in the third week of April, 3 weeks later, we were going to have an unconference to be able to help our teachers, because whatever it was that we thought that they needed to know at the beginning of April would be completely different than what they would actually need 3 weeks into April in 2020, because things kept developing and the tools that school districts were giving out were completely different. So we planned an Unconference. We marketed this event all over Twitter, and we were able to get people from 24 states and 7 countries involved in our programming when we were usually just focused on the Bay Area. We took topics via Eventbrite. When people registered, they said, what are 3 things that you really want to discuss and learn from other educators? And then during the session, we had hundreds of people, hundreds of educators show up to share their stories and learn from each other. All of the topics that they submitted, instead of thinking of as curating, I think we kind of raked them together of like basically having a giant spreadsheet of, I think it was 850 session topics that people proposed. We actually put them on Post-it notes on a wall, grouped them together, and came up with their common themes, and then hosted 12 different concurrent sessions times 2 or 3 different session times. And that was how we were able to have many different topics happening. Now, the important thing here about this story is the fact that we, again, because of the pandemic, teachers week to week was changing, and everybody was in crisis mode. And we knew that they were so stressed that we wanted to use an Unconference as an opportunity for people to be engaged in small groups, to be able to be heard and seen, to be able to know that there were resources available for them, and to really feel like they could leave with so many different things that they could do. Everything from how to use Zoom online to how to do project-based learning. And it was the largest event we'd ever produced. So we were really excited about Unconferences at CUE San Francisco. So I want you to imagine back to your last in-person event. What was the most special moment during it? Like, think of the big conference. Like, I miss in-person events so much. I'm so sad that CMX Summit isn't in person, because it is truly one of the most magical events when you actually get to be there with other community managers in person. Oftentimes, I feel like when I miss South by Southwest, when I miss being at CMX Summit, it's sometimes not the sessions. It's those amazing times where you're sitting next to somebody in a session and you start talking to them, and then you say, hey, this session brought us together in a room, but would you like to have lunch and talk more about this? And it sparks the relationship. Like, I feel like conferences in person are really great at sparking relationships. But I think in the time of virtual events, we're oftentimes being delivered so much information that we're not actually able to like sit back and like actually develop these relationships with each other during the event. So I'd like you to reflect, and I'm going to paste the worksheet that you'll be able to use into the chat. Yes, the open bars, that is definitely something that people are missing from an event. I also miss the body languages. Oh, I miss hugs. I miss hugs so much. So I just put a Google Doc link into the chat. Don't request access. I just make a copy by going to File, and then you can click on Make a Copy, and then you'll be able to edit and be able to like add as you go along. And then of course, I'm sure you're already taking notes, but these are 6 points that I wanted you to think about when you're thinking about planning an Unconference, and I'll be dropping some more resources into the chat as well as we go along. So again, the first part, who is my Unconference audience and what might they gain from an Unconference? And then secondly, I'd like you to reflect on what an Unconference might look like for you. It's completely okay if you can't answer that topic because we're so early in this presentation. And feel free to share this in the chat. Oh, I also miss vendors as well. Oh, goodness. Thank you, Ben. I really appreciate that. So I'm going to paste again. Thank you, Ben, for pasting in there. I really appreciate that. Okay, so you go to the link that's in there, it's a Google Doc. You'll be able to make a copy of it, the worksheet for Unconferences. Breaking my record from how many simultaneous users have ever been in one of my worksheets before. And then I'm just going to give you 2 minutes to kind of reflect on what is your Unconference audience and the things that we've talked about so far about these formats. Oh, the Jeopardy theme. That would have been a really great sound effect right now. Cool. So I see some people putting their audience into the chat. Again, you can use the worksheet as well. I'm really loving all the interactivity you guys are having right now in the chat. I definitely recommend, as my 4th CMX Summit, slide into some people's DMs here if you see people who are doing stuff in your space or have interesting points, because you can, if you meet here, you can have some really great conversations later, or maybe y'all will be able to brainstorm in this chat some topics that you'd like to talk about at our Unconference at 11 a.m. Pacific time. Cool. Ooh, remote teams. That would make a really, really, really great Unconference. Okay, so we've done a little reflecting. I'm going to move on to the next stage. Where does an Unconference fit in my event strategy? Now, I'm not proposing that Unconferences replace all of the other types of events that you're doing. I love happy hour events. I love lightning talks and ignite talks. I love panels. I love presentations, workshops, masterminds. There's so many different types of them. But we found that Unconferences, based on the fact that, again, things have been changing so fast, if you're doing a session, if you're curating session topics at a conference and you start curating 6 months out, you often find that these topics may not be as relevant when it gets closer, and that there's topics that you would have liked to have included. So I think that Unconferences definitely meet the demand in that way. So I'm thinking right now for my organization about doing an Unconference. We do monthly events, and so I'd like to do an Unconference quarterly, because Unconferences, after we started doing them, became our most popular event. But does it have to be your most popular and largest event? It doesn't have to. Really think about the fact that when you're going to do an Unconference, the first time you try anything, you might want to start small. And you might want to start with your power users, the people who like to talk and collaborate together, who are really excited to meet each other and develop relationships. Might not be best if you're super nervous about the fact that all of your community members are lurkers and not as engaged, and you're kind of concerned that maybe perhaps together nobody would initiate conversations in a breakout room. But I have a tool that I'm going to share with you later that would help facilitate conversations within your rooms. So you can think again, where does an Unconference fit in your event strategy? I want to be doing them quarterly. Some people do them annually. And again, start small with your first one. The people who are supposed to be there will show up, and the people who don't show up aren't supposed to be there. We don't charge for our Unconference programming. We took donations during our event registration, and that was able to cover all of our technology costs. But if you have staffing concerns that you need to be compensated for your event, pretty sure you could probably do that. I just kind of feel like for beta events for Unconferences, if you're starting small, charging may not make sense, but feel free to do what you want there. So here's some rules that you should stick to for all Unconferences. And it's super important to communicate this beforehand, because you need to manage expectations with an Unconference. So first of all, share the mic. You want to make sure at an Unconference that everyone gets a chance to share in a room. So you need to set the ground in both your event description, your reminder emails, and also when you kick off your event, to allow people to know that it's okay to be like, that was a really good point, Jade. Why don't we hear from somebody else? And to make sure that people step in to do that. because there's always a super user who's so passionate about sharing for 45 minutes. But that's not what an unconference is for. Secondly, everyone plays a role in moving the conversation along. So this isn't necessarily having one facilitator in the role of doing that. Everyone takes ownership in the actual discussion. And third, it's okay to find other sessions. I like to call this in person the rule of 2 feet, and online the rule of 2 fingers. So if you're in an unconference session and it's not meeting your needs, then it's completely okay to walk out 5 minutes later. In fact, I'm completely okay if you walk over to Howard's session right now too. And just to find another session that meets your needs. So it's really important to be able to have a platform that allows you to move between rooms. And fourth, go with the process and have fun. So important. So those are basically the ground rules that you will probably want to set up. You might want to establish more, but I like to think of the important thing of this as an event type is not to overproduce it, that it is a very intrepid model that just kind of works. But you'll probably feel more comfortable after you attend your first unconference, which is really important. If you're going to organize one, just find one online to attend first, because it will make so much more sense. So how are session topics determined at an unconference? So many different ways. First, you want to start with a broad, open question or prompt. I used to, when I first started hosting them, ask the question of, what would you like to learn? And then I decided that was actually generating more things where people wanted a sage on the stage to like lead a workshop on. And so we changed it in our next event to be, what do you want to discuss with other educators? And then I now want to change it to, what do you want to geek out about with other educators? So my question for you is, what do you want to geek out about with other community managers? So it's totally okay when people are doing this to submit multiple responses. When I was using Eventbrite as a registration tool, we would have each person submit 3 different topics. And then another way to do it, it will be on my next slide. So you have to think about these 2 questions of, when are responses going to be collected? And how are responses going to be collected? So when means, is there a deadline for submission? I've found that it is usually helpful to have a deadline that is maybe 2 or 3 days before the event, to allow you to sift through all the data. Because if you have hundreds of people coming and they each submit 3 topics, that is a load of things to curate. That's if you're doing it in pre-registration. But again, there are other ways to do it. So I'm going to put this bit.ly link in the chat, or somebody else might paste it for me. Peter, I'll get to that question in a few more slides. Good one. But there's a bit.ly CMX Summit, Uncon, the capitalization matters. Give me a second, I'll paste it in for you. Thank you, Kelly, I really appreciate that. Cool. Wow, wow, wow. Okay, so we're gonna go over to the Padlet board that we're using, and I'm going to show you what user-generated content has been submitted so far. So we're just going to spend 3 minutes over here on the Padlet. Again, Padlet is linked in the chat using the bit.ly link, bit.ly/CMX Summit Uncon. And you can see these are a few topics that people have suggested that they'd like to talk about. Again, we're selecting things that we would want to discuss together, not have presented to us. So the Padlets, as you're looking through them, you can use the plus button at the bottom right. And if you see topics that you actually would really like to join at 11 a.m. Pacific time to talk about with other people, put a heart next to that specific one. At about 10 minutes till, Anne Marie from the CMX team is actually going to go through these, and she's going to take the top voted for ideas and she's going to rename their individual rooms as those. So after this session, you'll be able to go into one with the title that is based on what people selected here. So this is one method you could do for collecting. I've already talked about pre-event registration. When I was doing it in person, people would post on a whiteboard a Post-it note of their topic that they were interested in, and then we would group them together on the whiteboard, and then after we got an approximate number of them, that was how we would determine the rooms. Okay, what does approximate number mean? Great question. So I like to do, here is my unconference math. However many people registered, figure out what your attrition rate is for free events or whatever the price point you're putting at. So for us, our attrition rate is 50% for all of our events, and that was true for our Unconference programming too. So if we were to have 500 people register, 250 people would show up. Now take that number and divide it by how many people you think should be in a breakout room. I like to say 7 maximum, but there are ways to obviously have breakout rooms work for larger, but if it gets more than 12 people, it's not a discussion and there's just too many lurkers. So again, the math, full event registration times attrition rate, so 50% or whatever, and then you divide that by 7. That is how many breakout rooms you should have in your event. And that is how Anne Marie will determine how many unconference sessions we're going to have at 11 a.m. So I'm really liking the Padlet because it's like updating as we go. It's not sorting them right now by ranks. I feel like another hack to do it within Bevy was we could use, and we're not going to right now, but we could use the Q&A tool and have people put their topics in there, and then based on the upvoting, that would determine the top, like however many would help us decide what the topics are. So that would be a really cool hack. Wow, so many cool ideas. I want to go to so many of them. And we'll talk a little bit about FOMO in a moment, because FOMO is super real at Unconferences. Now you can continue adding stuff until probably I think 10:50. Anne Marie will put the cutoff time into the chat. But now we're going to go back to the slides. There we go. Cool. So here's just, again, the different ways that you could have collected and a few other tools that you could use. And again, once people have told you what you want to learn about, then you build your session board. Now I'm going to give you an example of a session board, and I'm going to paste that link into the chat that you can do, because if I put it on the screen, honestly, the text would just be too small. It would be way, way, way too small. So if you use the Google Docs link that I put into the chat, I'll show an example of how we did what's called our session board. So if you have that open, okay, I'll just share it. Again, I know that it's too small. You can use the link to view it yourself. So when we did this event, we partnered with 3 other organizations, and that helped us bring in new audiences to each of our communities. So we just wanted to have the number of rooms in this Google Doc and in columns, and then however many sessions you have in the rows, and then the links are not going to work in the example I posted here, but we did have links to what's called shared notes, which we'll talk about momentarily. Now we want, again, it says insert bit.ly link because we wanted a bit.ly link at the top and the bottom, because we wanted to be able to display this on the screen within our Zoom session. And we wanted people who are seeing it, or we're seeing screenshots on Twitter for what the session board was. We wanted them to be able to get there. It feels pretty weird to like have a link in a doc to the actual doc that you're looking at. It's super meta, but it was important when you're doing screen shares. Okay, so these are the example topics that I would have never, well, okay, that's not true. I would have had a few of these at a conference, but it was way more interesting to see what our conference, like community, actually curated. One of the important things that I wanted to think about when we did our October event for educators is we actually had a lot of submissions for talking about racial justice and social justice issues in the classroom submitted. And because that was a topic that we knew, we thought it'd be best to have a facilitator in there that wasn't presenting, but knew how to facilitate conversations about racial justice. And we weren't asking, we asked if she would be open to doing that with us. And we had a full conversation about it. So it was us working and collaborating with an educator of color to be able to facilitate a conversation about racial justice as one of our session topics in October, which was our most popular topic. And she was able to make sure that people felt comfortable and safe in the Unconference, that they would be open to sharing questions, while also making sure that there wasn't a lot of white privilege shared in that session. So that was just like one example of a topic that we thought was could have gone in too many different directions, that we wanted to do that topic justice, that we brought in a facilitator for that. But it wasn't a prepared conversation. It was just somebody who knew how to steer people in the right direction and to share adequate resources. So that way educators of color didn't feel like they had to be explaining things to white educators. Sorry for the tangent there. It was an important conversation. So again, thank you for loving my tangent, Heather. So one of the things that I like to think about here, again, consider addressing topics, but I really thought it was really important to be able to allow people to submit affinity groups. So we actually had in one of our later Unconference programs where it was, even though our conference was open to all and we wanted it to be inclusive, we actually had several different requests that were about, I would love to just have a session, like a safe space for educators of color to be able to come together and talk with other educators of color. And so we were really excited to be able to facilitate making that happen for them. So that was a second example of another way to do a subgroup, an affinity group within a session. And you could also do it for like middle school teachers or developers that work for developer tools, or whatever subgroup that you're managing. But again, that wasn't a topic that we chose. It was submitted by our community. Oh, Rita, that's a good question. So some people ask how long in advance were the topics decided. It depends on your event. You determine. We had, during one of our events, people would submit things 3 days. They had to be submitted in their event registration, and then we've also done it. You have to submit something within 3 days of before the event happening. So this is what it looked like when it was an in-person event. Okay, so some things that you might want to think of when you're planning. Here's the considerations for before: platform, logistics, marketing, and outreach. We'll talk about platform shortly. During the event, think of the day of roles. Definitely recruit other people to troubleshoot with you. So you want to make sure that there are people in the Zoom or whichever platform you're using that are like in the main room all day or all 3 hours, however long it is, to be able to help people with technical difficulties and to get them where they want to go and to make the rooms feel really safe. Oh, this works for in-person conferences as well, Unconferences as well. And then after, you want to think about participant follow-up and debrief. Participant follow-up could be like, thanks for coming. And then the debrief part of it would be learning from it. So that way your next Unconference will be even better than the one that you just planned. Okay, co-organizing with your community. This may stress some people out, but I think it's so incredibly important, especially for an Unconference and for bringing in so much energy to an event. So when you're co-organizing with your community, it is so recommended to bring other people who are part of your community, your most active, passionate users who are super helpful and just like love everybody to co-organize with you. So you could put together the project plan, but just kind of like get them bought into why you want to do an Unconference and use them to help invite new people. I'll talk about some other tools you can use to empower your community, specifically your community as co-organizers, to be able to have them invite more people to your event. You can also appoint your community members as co-organizers, as facilitators within the room. And I could go on a huge tangent about that too, but we're going to move on. Here's some goals in selecting a platform, because honestly, I think that this was one of the most popular things that several other community managers asked me. How do I choose which platform? I've mentioned Zoom a few times. That doesn't mean that's the platform you have to do. It's just something that people feel super familiar with in terms of breakout rooms. So here's the functions. I think it's very important to identify what the functions are that you need for a tool before you identify what the form is or which actual tool you're going to use. So the first part, you need to have the ability to change the number of breakout rooms. This means that 3 days before the event, you may think that you need like 12 breakout rooms, and then the day before, your attendance significantly increases, and now you need 15 breakout rooms. So you need to be able to change that. And again, you don't know how many people are going to show up on the day. So you want something that's flexible in changing the number of breakout rooms. There should be no specific group size, and there should be no, you want a platform that's not going to auto assign people. So you want to make sure that if one room has 7, one room has 12, that's completely okay with your platform. You want there to be able to be free flowing movement between the rooms. So again, people have to be able to opt into a room and opt out to use their 2 fingers to go to another room and check out the next topic. Again, you want it to be small groups. I feel like most platforms that have breakout rooms work with this. And again, a bigger hack is if you were using my suggestion of that Google Docs tool for the session board. Before, we thought breakout rooms were really great in Zoom, where people could move between them because you used to not be able to. We just appointed a co-organizer in each room, and they just dropped their own Zoom link into the session board before the event started. And that's how we just had 10 different events. You'd go to one main event, and then you'd click on a link in the session board to go to another actual room instead of a breakout room. And then they could use the session board to move between them. So it was just like another way to think about hacking rooms if the tool you want to use doesn't necessarily have breakout rooms. I think it's a little clunky though. And I love this point, is it's ideal if new rooms can be formed and added. So important. So you want it that maybe you have 15 rooms and 25 people show up to one room, and several people want to talk about they're in a backyard farming topic at an Unconference. Some people want to talk about raising chickens, and other people want to talk about raising plants. And I'm sure everybody wants to do both, but there are two tangents emerging in the same room. And so you just want some empty rooms within your platform that people can just be like, hey, backyard chicken folk, why don't we all migrate over to this extra room? And in some points where they're geeking out, you want them to be able to continue with this backyard chickens crew in their own room into the next session time. So again, that was the last of goals in selecting a platform if you need to do a screenshot. Okay, shared notes. I think that this is a ridiculously fun part of an unconference culture that I want to share with you. So here is an example. I realize the text is probably very small of what an unconference shared notes template could look like. So I basically created a template, duplicated it for each session time, and then each room. So in the case of a 12 different sessions times 3 session times, I created 12 times 3, 36 different versions of this template, and I organized everything into a Google Drive folder, and I made sure that they were all linked from the session board that I showed you earlier. This was important because it was kind of a facilitation guide that when people showed up to a room, they were able to have get like icebreakers going in the doc, and then also when people started going on tangents or sharing and dropping resources in the session, that they could put them into the notes. Now, this makes it super helpful because oftentimes people get so excited sharing at unconferences that they stop taking their own notes, and then they feel so sad like 2 or 3 hours later that they didn't get good notes. But when multiple people are doing it simultaneously, oh my gosh, the notes are so much better. And the best part about this, according to my event surveys, the shared notes were actually the favorite feature of our unconference programming, because instead of having FOMO of, oh my God, there's too many great topics to cover here, people knew that their friends would take good notes in the other sessions, and they would take good notes in their sessions. And then at the end of the event, all of the participants at the event would get notes from all of the different sessions, and then they would get to learn about all 36 different things. But you want to make a decision as to whether or not your individual rooms feel comfortable sharing their notes outside of their actual small group, especially if they're putting contact information in there. So I will later drop a link to a shared notes template. I actually added facilitation techniques to the top of it that were really helpful in our event. And then I also put some icebreakers in the doc too, so that way everybody after they left my room would still be equipped with information. Managing expectations is so important, because unconferences like sound like an easy topic, but they're not easy for somebody to understand if they've never been to an unconference before. So think about your event messaging, make sure you have clear descriptions, and it would be so incredibly helpful if you just made like a TikTok video or an Instagram video or just something that does not have to be produced. Make it super low stakes, saying this is what an unconference is. And there are so many YouTube videos about unconferences that you can look at that you could share instead, but I think that it's better when it comes from somebody in the community. And oh yes, seed the audience. This is why co-organizing with your community is so important. Once you get people recruited to be co-organizers, send them to another unconference so they get the feel, because if you can seed an unconference with people who've already been to an unconference before, it will help you create the culture of an unconference within yours and make everybody feel more comfortable and safe during the event, because there's somebody else going, oh, this is what's supposed to happen in this session, or why don't you talk next? So I also recommend, like, well, it's super optional, but we had room facilitators, and we made sure to train them beforehand on like how to run a breakout room, so many different tools that they could use, and how to like steer the conversation, how to like get lurkers and activate them into conversers, how to lead icebreakers in a virtual room. And so we created that beforehand, and we did a 45-minute training beforehand, and we're like, you do not have to own this conversation. You do not need to be an expert in the room. We just want there to be a person that's smiling in the room saying, who wants to share next? So it just would keep the conversation moving. When you think of promoting your event, the most important thing is to mobilize your community. Unconferences have been an acquisition strategy for our community, where again, we were getting educators to promote it to other educators. We were introducing so many people to our brand. You can use Twitter analytics to basically see like the impressions that you're getting from your audience. You can brainstorm a gazillion different hashtags that you could use. I also recommend using different networks. So if there are different professional organizations that people in your audience are associated with, promote within those. You can obviously use Twitter, brainstorm all of the different hashtags you could use. And personal email invitations are so incredibly important for promoting your event. So incredibly important. So one of the things that I recommend so much is to put together a promotional resource folder that you could share with other people to empower them to share for you. So we put together a whole bunch of images that we created in Canva, and that would promote our event. And we had them in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, every different size. And we made some of them animated using Canva. And then we had blurbs. We had, here's 25 different tweets that you could tweet about the event, and the hashtags are already here for you. Here are email invitations for inviting a friend. Here's an email for sending to a listserv to invite somebody there. We just had everything that made it super easy. And then we would just send stuff to our most active users and people that we knew were network connectors. And then we would invite them and ask them if they could share our event with others. So with that, okay, I could have talked for so much longer about Unconferences, but I really want there to be time for Q&A. So Jamie's going to help me go through the Q&A and answer your questions. So I know there were so many questions in the chat, but if you guys want to go over to the tab that says Q&A and drop in and vote for the questions that you'd like us to chat about.
Awesome, Jessica. Well done. That was really great. There was so much engagement there. And I think it's such a top of mind subject. We're all trying to run events, do them virtually, make them more interesting. So yeah, we are doing like an internal meetup at my company, and I suggested an unconference thing. So that was before I saw the topic of this. So even more timely. So you've given me so much food for thought. So I'm sure there's loads of questions. Let's just dive in.
Let's do it.
If we start at the top. So voted the favorite question from Danica. One of my hesitations in doing an unconference is that you get people who aren't experts acting like experts. Yeah. And sharing misinformation. How do you combat that?
Oh, misinformation. Such a topic of 2020, 2021. And I'm sure several other community managers would love to talk about like that as its own session topic. Misinformation. I think that, again, the curating a facilitator in the room who might be able to detect BS is kind of important. And it's also dependent on the topics that you're curating for it. I don't typically like to reject a topic if it's one of the most voted for topics, because that would show a large amount of engagement for that session. So I think it's important to have those hard conversations in groups. But yeah, I don't know if I have the perfect answer for you there. I think that hopefully there are multiple people in the room who could disagree and try to say, I kind of see it a different way. Here is some more accurate information, and make sure to drop some links, which is also why the shared notes could be a really great place to be able to share this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of the community sorting itself out, isn't there? Which happens like in forums in the same way. One person's very opinionated and everyone else is kind of like, not sure I agree. I think it is different when people are obviously talking and things. But yeah, it's a difficult one to facilitate.
Yeah,
All right.
empowering your super users to be those facilitators is so important.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to Michelle, I think that is. I am wondering how you handle more introvert people in an unconference.
Really great. So at an unconference, a lot of people would think that an unconference is designed for extroverts. And I did get a very few people in our survey data from our unconference programming that said that conferences felt like they were too energetic. I think that CMX Summit in person has done a great job of designing introvert spaces that I'm sure David might have some resources that he could drop in the chat about how the CMX team thinks about designing introvert spaces. But having an introvert room is one of the things that CMX Summit has done in the past that I think would be really great for an in-person unconference. But in an online unconference, I think that some of the introverts that came to our events just preferred to be lurkers, and that's completely okay. Not everybody has to speak up in a topic. Some people prefer to take notes or just quietly reflect while they're hearing everybody collaborate in a discussion.
Perfect. All right. Another one from Fatima. Can you suggest some unconferences to attend before we host one?
Oh, yes. Okay. So I will try to share my slides after this, and I'll put a form in. Yes, I'm going to put the form into the Google chat. I will not add you to an email list of any sort, I promise. But if you would like more resources and toolkits, I can send you a few more of them. And then in the questions part of it, I can send you a link. But some of the ones that I have gone to are Ed Camp. I've been to a bar camp. You could really just type in Unconference on Eventbrite or on Meetup, and you could find so many different ones. And you could just hop in to an Unconference and attend one session just to see what the facilitation and the platform was like, and then peace out. That's completely okay. Rule of 2 feet to leave early, totally okay. But I mean, I really like the ed camps, but they also have a culture that it's for teachers by teachers, and so like vendors aren't, and people who work at companies aren't normally as welcome at an ed camp. But they're so friendly. So you just look for an unconference for any topic, and I'm sure that there are so many of them being posted on Twitter as well.
Cool. Another question here from Pixie, maybe a bit similar to one, but what's your number one tip to silence someone who is mic hoarding really badly? Perhaps this is where people vote with their feet a little bit too, I guess.
Yeah, that sometimes would get sad and frustrating. But again, if you empower a super user within your community to be a facilitator, create a facilitation guide, and specifically mention what to do when somebody's hoarding the mic. If you make your co-organizers / co-facilitators admins of the event, they might be able to actually do a mute if that happens, or if any sort of harassing behavior. We didn't talk about harassment yet, but part of letting go of control in an unconference means that you need to empower your community to be able to moderate itself within a session, and being able to mute other people is one of those things.
Right on. And I know that you touched on some of this, but Anne was asking, are there best practices or guidelines in terms of number of attendees, length, structure, if any? Not sure where to even start.
Sure, absolutely. So length could be varied. I've heard that a lot of people think that 30 minutes can be too short. Some people said it was too long. We got conflicting feedback on that. Most people liked the 45 minutes from our data of several unconferences. So 45 minutes was great for us. Start with 45 minutes for your first unconference, and then make sure to do a survey asking people how long that was to figure out what your next unconference should be timed at. And then how many people per session. Again, I would just make there be enough concurrent sessions in order to be like 7 per room, but know that some rooms are going to be bigger and some rooms could only be 2 people, and that's okay.
Okay. So moving on to Jay, could you please share with us some recordings of any successful unconferences?
Oh, no, I can't. Why? Because it's not kosher. Unconferences are live discussions and they lose their magic as recording. And most people would not feel that they were in a safe space if they knew that they were being recorded and it was being put up there. That's why the shared notes are a great place that feel like anonymous when they're taking the notes. So that way there's not like a record in the future, specifically that they were the person that like posted something, which again, fear of misinformation is super real in that situation. So I like to look at the shared notes, and I only share the notes with the people who actually attended the event, not people who registered and didn't show up, and not the public.
Right. And maybe similar to this from Federica, how do you select facilitators and how can you make sure people are not intimidated by them and feel free to share?
Yeah, they have to be members of your community. Don't use employees. That's uncomfortable. Make sure to actually active users, like the people who are always like replying within your community, and then appointing them.
Okay, and maybe time for one last one. Natalia asks, what do you do when a breakout room stays empty?
Ooh, that's okay. It's completely okay. Like, you just like, unconferences feel uncomfortable because it feels like there's so much stuff that could go wrong. But these are all things that aren't going wrong. It's just people getting what they need by going to where they need to be. And that's okay. Not all conversations have to happen.
All right, thank you, Jessica. So I guess next up is an unconference.
Yes.
So yes, if you head out to the lobby, you should be able to join in there. So really looking forward to that. Thanks again, Jessica, and all the best to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your CMX Summit.
Bye, everyone. Have a great morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are.